Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Harder Shaft podcast. I think back to 1982. It was the summer of 1982, queuing up at the Foreign Theatre to go and see the phenomenal movie E.T. I remember leaving the cinema thinking, what was that? And I saw that movie probably 7 times in that year. I just totally couldn't get enough of that show. On today's show, we're going to be talking about up there, extraterrestrials, unidentified flying objects, whatever it is. And we're going to speak to a semi-expert, someone that I know really well and someone that's got lots of things to say. And I'd like to welcome to the show Paul Mischel. Hey, Paul, how are you?
Good. How are you, Joey? There's
I'm
always
good.
that's the trope, isn't it? You know, that's what my sister's got on her phone every time I ring her.
But the funny thing is that I remember there was a time that I really wanted to watch as many things about it. But then they started to become scary. And then I remember the Mel Gibson movie Signs, where there was an invasion. And then after that, I stopped watching anything to do with like up there. But I sort of find that I'm starting to go back to that sort of genre now. Why do you think all of a sudden it's become news? Like, I feel like in the last year or so, it's really become elevated and everyone's talking about it. So what do you think has caused that?
Personally, I think it's always been news.
Right.
I just think that it's been stigmatized significantly and intentionally by the United States government. So that's what's coming out, and that people then don't want to touch it because they think it's the domain of tinfoil hat wearing individuals and people who are into conspiracy theories and so forth. And I think that what's coming out now is that the United States government have run a very, very clever disinformation campaign while at the same time investigating it in a very deep way. And so 2017 was the release of, it was in a sense, it was walked out of the Department of Defense, but legally. So I don't know how that happens. And it was some footage of anomalous craft flying in ways that defied our understanding of physics. And so 2017, those videos that were caught on a forward-looking infrared camera on some of the top aircraft at the time really started to spark debate. Well, if they've got this on camera and they're seeing it, then how many times is this happening? And so it really started to open it up. Then there was a news article that was written by two journalists, so Leslie Keane and Blumenthal. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, and it was something like Black Auras and Black Projects or whatever it was, and it was printed in the Washington Post, I believe. It really set tongues wagging because there was this admission that came from the United States government that yes, these things exist. Now, if you take a look at ufology has been up until about now always been about like proving that unidentified flying objects exist. Well, we're beyond that now.
Yeah, I've talked about that, haven't I? We've talked about that. Like, I feel if I see a little green man, then I can say to you, yes, they exist. So that's good that you're bringing that up because I think a lot of people want the proof, but you're saying there is proof, but it's been covered.
It's proof. It's measurable. That's what they're pointing to. Now, is it little green men? Nobody knows. That's the point. Well, if they know, they haven't released that information yet. There seems to be indications that they've got a sense of what's going on. But it's news because what we're seeing now is Senate hearings in the United States, changes in legislation that will come through perhaps in December when Biden signs the new legislation in, a broader exploration of the relationship of the military-industrial complex and aerospace companies that have been working on this sort of technology. And to give you a bit of an idea, if you want to look for some type of evidence, don't take my word for it. Take a look at the legislation that's been put in front of the president, or will be put in front of the president of the United States. It references non-human intelligence, craft of non-human origin or unknown origin, and the requirement on the Department of Defense and any contractors to reveal what they know about what they've got within 60 days of that legislation going into law in December, and 180 days, they must provide access to Congress for these materials. Now, it references non-human intelligence 26 times in that legislation. It is unlike anything I've ever seen. And if you want some sort of confirmation, because it's not disclosure, but if you want some sort of confirmation, there's confirmation that they've been investigating this for quite a long time, and they wouldn't be putting this into legislation unless they knew that there was something else going on. And there is some deeper stuff going on in regards to, why they've been hiding this, and it makes sense. If you've got exotic technology that has the potential to change the game, change your capacity as a superpower, and potentially gain a significant advantage over your adversaries, it makes sense to keep that a secret. It's a national security interest. So
the thing that I feel in my heart is that America, for some reason, the first thing that I feel, tell me if I'm wrong, that they go to is safety. Like, rather than connection, it's always about, are we going to get attacked? And I'm thinking, like, why is there always this thing where it's a negative rather than a positive thing? Like, why is it? And that's the thing that we were talking about off air about the movies. Like, a lot of movies are about the aliens coming, and then we've got to save the Earth, and so it's interesting how, to me, there has to be a correlation between that and the manufacturers of these things, right? These contractors that you're talking about, because I don't know, it all boils down to money. I think that's my opinion. But why do you think that? Why do you think that there is fear based around anything coming here versus excitement or optimism or all that?
Right. Well, take a look at mankind's history. Anytime there's been an advanced civilization that's come into contact with a more primitive civilization, it hasn't been good things for the primitive civilization.
Yeah, it must be sad.
I think we're there's a certain degree of xenophobia there. We don't even recognise similarity in human beings, let alone what happens when you've got something that doesn't even look like us, doesn't think like us, doesn't behave like us, doesn't conform to civilization's rules and requirements, and what we consider to be ethical behavior and so forth. I would imagine that we would perceive that to be a threat.
Yeah.
The other thing as well is when something invades national, your sovereign borders, that is a threat, regardless of whether it's good or not. And what we've got right now is we've got an admission by the United States government, and dare I say that by implication any other government around the world, that if they can't stop these things from flying through their air, entering into their airspace, and they've changed the term UFO to UAP, and there's a reason why they've changed that, because it's considered to be an unidentified anomalous phenomena, because it moves through multiple mediums: space, air, and water. So they've seen them traveling under the water,
right? And time, maybe.
They can't stop them, can't chase them. They can't bring them down. They actively jam radar. There's lots of credible reports by people who are pilots that were trained. One of them was trained at Top Gun and was the head of a very elite Navy air squadron. And he was recently in front of the United States Senate disclosing what he has had an experience of, and he's very straightforward. He says, don't make it a big official. This is what it was. This is what my experience was, and so forth. And he's very direct. His name is Commander Dave Fravor, and they asked him a very specific question. They said, if you were, if it was hostile, would you have been in a position to defend your craft? And he said, not a chance. So when you hear admissions from some of the top pilots going, I encountered this thing, it engaged me, and then it also acted hostile from the perspective it actively jammed, I think through active and passive means, but active means in airspace around the United States. And he said that is that's a hostile act. He said if you're engaging with other aircraft, you don't actively jam, unless you're in war. He said that is actually a sign that this is something that was acting in a hostile way based upon what we would consider it, but he never felt threatened. And I think that was an important distinction. But because we've got, in a sense, a superpower that spends more than any other country in the world on defence spending. Now, defence or offence spending, it depends. I mean, defence is a nice euphemism, isn't it? And they can't stop these things. They can't intercept them properly. They can't do anything. That's a sign that there's a very big gap for them in their technological capability, and also that. And what it's inviting us to do is consider our understanding of the laws of physics, because they don't behave like any craft that we have. And also Commander Dave Fravor in the recent Senate hearings said, we have nothing, because his encounter happened about 10 years ago. We had nothing back then 10 years ago. We have nothing now that matches it. We have nothing in the pipeline in 10 years' time. And he hasn't specified what he does now that he's left the Navy. And so what they're highlighting is there's a massive technological gap there. And so therefore you've just had, in a sense, an admission by somebody who's very well connected that the United States government is not the most dominant technological
in the world.
military in the world if we look at this as a military thing, and that's a threat. So it makes sense. Makes perfect sense.
I mean, like, you know how we live in the era now of phones and all that, and there's lots of evidence, and, you know, we will share my experience with what I recorded. But the thing is that because there's all that evidence, I would have thought that would have been enough to make us believe more, right? Because, like, you know, we've only had phones for under 20 years. And all of a sudden, you know, people are being called crazy. There's Senate hearings and all that. So what is it that people don't want to believe? Like, why do we, you know, I've seen so many videos now. I don't know, you know, I guess I don't know what's real or not. But when you see it yourself, right, and I've seen it more than once, and you sort of think, am I crazy? The reality is that I didn't feel like it was hostile. I didn't feel like it was just hovering, and then it went, right? So why do we, you know, why are people struggling to still believe in this? There's footage and there's evidence and there's hundreds of people that have seen it. Like, why do they still not? Why is there still not this thing where, okay, we can see that's true?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. One, the disinformation campaign. So that's been one thing. You know, there probably is some very legitimate footage out there, and then you know, you've got organisations that are running counterintelligence operations, and that's coming through. So I know it sounds very conspiratorial.
No, I love conspiracy anyway, because our whole life should be conspiracy.
Just for our listeners, right?
Well, can I just define, right? Conspiracy to me is just an opinion.
Okay, all right, and I know that it's been used as a bit of a pejorative now. You know, like a conspiracy theorist. I've looked into that sort of stuff, and I had a very, you know, deep involvement in that. I've been studying the UFO stuff since I was about 8 years old when I got exposed to a book called Mysteries of the Unexplained. It was a Reader's Digest book that my grandmother had, and there was a second volume. I've still got those books. She gave them to me, and I absolutely treasure them. So this has been going back a long time, and you know, like the cover up started happening around the time of Roswell, New Mexico, where the United States military had something that crashed in their backyard in New Mexico. And, you know, one minute they're saying we've had an alien craft land, we've got debris. You know, there were people who were saying, yes, this is stuff that's legitimately, you know, the material, or as they call it nowadays, metamaterial, was unlike anything they've touched before. Next thing you know, they've walked that statement back. They've put a guy out in front of the public, and they've gone, oh, it was a crash balloon, it was a mogul balloon. And the United States government has changed their story around this multiple times. So, you know, like, you take a look at that particular moment in time, and the disinformation came through about that event, which is now starting to be revisited again. And the documentation around that has never really been fully declassified. There's lots of redacted stuff inside of there. So what are they hiding? You know, if it's a balloon, I mean, we're, you know, 1940, I think 1947.
I think America's hiding, not just America hides everything. Everything's, you know.
Well, rightfully so. National security and national security.
I know, but sometimes, you know, people within their own country are actually investigating people in their own country who are investigating people. So that to me is like confusing. Why the CIA, the FBI, and this group and that group, everyone's keeping a secret. So can I share what I saw? Like, can I share? So
can I just finish that little piece about why people don't believe like what they're seeing? I think one, we've got CGI coming through now, right? CGI is pretty good nowadays compared to what it was. People can produce stuff on their computers. There's also active misinformation and disinformation out there. Secondly, now that we've got things like AI and we've got, you know, incredible graphics, sometimes it's very hard to actually determine what's real, what's not. And you know, if someone gives you a really clear video, and I've seen some really incredibly clear videos, and because it's come from a source that you don't know, it's on YouTube or whatever it is, it's easy to go, you know what, that looks a little bit too clear to be real, but perhaps it is clear. I think one of the key qualities, though, is that you know, one of the qualities of a UAP, one of the observables, or, you know, lack of observables, is this low observability of them, and so they actually don't get picked up on camera all that well, which then creates the other side of the equation. It's like, well, why isn't it clear? You know, like, why we get this footage from, you know, what seems to be, you know, like a 1980s camera. So we get some mixed responses. If it's too clear, people say it's fake, it's CGI, and if it's not clear enough, they go, well, why is it? What does it look like? It's been filmed on a camera from the, you know, from the early 2000s. So you can't sort of win either way. I have a tendency to keep an open mind. I'm interested in not only the people's responses, but, you know, the quality of the footage right across. Because if you see something, you're going to film it until it disappears. Generally, right? But when you see these little snippets of there it is, and then they stop, I go, well, what happened? What happened to the beginning? What happened to the end? You know, when you're seeing people watching something, sometimes it's something that's been embedded into the video, and you're watching where they're looking, they're not even remotely looking in the direction, but it just gives this sort of sense of social proof that something was happening. But your footage, coming back to your footage, like when I saw that, when you shared that on Facebook, and thank you so much for sharing it, I was like, that's a good catch.
I know, but
That was
but the thing is, I
catch.
still don't know what that was. But just to go
Doesn't
on with
matter.
the believing thing, if we want, the way that I'm thinking at the moment is it's like COVID, right? COVID
Yeah.
is something that we can't see, but yet there was millions of people that didn't believe it was real, and there was millions of people that believed it. Now, even though we were in lockdown, people were dying, even though all those things were happening, still people were polarized. So can you imagine if UFOs did like if the polarization would be so extreme? But
And take a look at your response in your video. You're like
I know.
you're talking to yourself, and you're questioning what you're seeing with your own eyes, and you're filming it. And you weren't, like you admitted, you're not very technologically savvy in that regard. You weren't exactly like creating a fabricated piece of footage, but you caught what you caught.
Yeah. And because I wear glasses, so I think, is it that? I was trying to get my
I thought
dad
it was
to
one of the
see it.
clearest things I've seen. And, drone or not, it had no sort of flight control elements, didn't make any sound. It was a really interesting catch. I thought that's why I commented. I said, that's a good catch. Because
and I'm
I've
and
seen different
I'm
crafts, different
open. I
shapes.
think I'm open to the fact that I would hope that if there is anything out there, that it is a connection. So I feel, there have been times, and this is where I don't know what I'm really seeing when I'm driving home, and I live in Point Cook, so there's a period of the road that is not well lit, so there's you can see a lot of the sky clearly, and so I just see these things, and I did lots of investigating. Is it a plane? Because I do know the Avalon Airport and all that, but it was, and I checked flight parts. They weren't normal planes. So the thing that gets me was in those cases was the speed. The speed of this thing, how when it moved, a plane doesn't move that fast. Because when you look at a sky plane, moves quite slowly, really, right? So, but the hard thing is that I don't know how to explain it, so I just don't talk about it because you don't know what it is. That's the thing.
That's where the 5 observables come in, which I may not remember off the top of my head. I'll do my best. Lou Elizondo, who is one of the he's a counterintelligence officer, ex-counterintelligence officer for the United States government, who was brought into in a sense, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, so ATIP. He was involved with that. He actually left the military because he was basically saying this stuff is coming up. It's being caught, and yet nobody seems to be doing anything. It's a threat to national security, and if you don't do anything, we're going to have some sort of incident. And he referenced what he calls the 5 observables. Like what are you looking for when you're looking at a UAP? And one of them is like this positive lift. It can travel to exceptionally high levels in our atmosphere and go into space. That's why they call them UAP, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, because they're all domain. Space, air, water. They travel through all the different domains. The other one is rapid acceleration. So what you're talking there is there's one of the observables, this rapid acceleration, and also rapid, like this sort of very agile movement. It doesn't travel in the same way that a plane does. It can do a right angle turn at high speed. It can reach incredible amounts of speed, and one of the other ones is the low observability piece.
What's that?
It's the low observability. In other words, you can be looking at it, but you can't see it all that well. It's almost like and there's lots of theories about what might be going on there, whether that's a space-time distortion around it because it's using some sort of anti-gravity component to it. Who knows? The fact of the matter is there's been very credible pilots who have managed to capture them on their radar, but have been in close proximity, but haven't been able to see them when they should. And that's where the low observability piece comes through. So Ryan Graves, who runs a podcast called Merged, he had an experience where he was seeing these things on his screen. They were engaging. They were flying in close proximity, and he said during during the merge is when two aircraft come in close proximity to each other. Like when you see in Top Gun, they come in a dogfight. He said we should have by rights seen these things, and we couldn't see them, but all our senses were picking up on something around us. So there was some type of camouflage, cloaking, whatever it is, but the low observability piece is an important part, which then makes it hard when you think about, well, hang on a second, the 5 observables, of which number 4 is low observability, but there is something to do with the way in which they potentially adjust time and space, or alternatively, there's some sort of electrogravity field around them. There's something. I mean, it's beyond our
There
understanding.
has to be. I mean,
all domain, like the domains.
Mine was like a hang. It was like a hanging. It was like, you know what I mean. So it doesn't look like a drone, because a drone doesn't normally flat, right? So
it's lenticular. Yours is almost lenticular and disc shaped.
Yeah.
And what was interesting was it was very bright. It was very bright. It was bright.
Well, the thing is, it's so, I don't know if you've seen things. I think you have, right? Yeah,
I have seen plenty. Yes.
See, at night time, it's when I've seen them at night driving home, and I've only done it twice. Seen this again. I don't know if it was or not, but because it's night, you don't see that same thing. You don't see the shininess. You only see. It's a different. I see these lights that are, and to me, at night time, they're watching something, because it seems to be like, the thing that I found really interesting is they would go up and down really quickly, and I'm thinking, what's going on there? Okay, it's a drone watching the freeway, but there's nothing in my lifetime that I've seen move that fast. See, so at night,
the speed is not drone-like. The speed is.
Well, the agility of moving really quickly from one direction to another. That's the thing, right?
Changing direction. So there's two of the observables, right? So and also you got a little bit of positive lift. But I mean, the question is, where do they, like, when you've seen it, then what happens? I mean, like, do you stop and watch and then see from beginning to end where it goes, or just
no, because I'm driving. So I mean, I've thought about pulling over, but then I keep convincing myself not to, right? So I guess to lead into the next part of that, do you think that there is a susceptibility for people to believe or not believe? Like, are there certain people that are drawn? Because I saw a documentary about a guy who had this ability to feel when there's something coming, and then he would go outside and they'd be there, right? Now, again, we can only speculate what's going on, but he was really open to it. So there was an attraction. He called it an energy that was exchanged, right? And then there are the people that don't believe, because while I was driving, I'd say, I'm sure other people are seeing what I'm seeing. But then I realized, oh my God, everyone's just looking one way, right? And I'm looking everywhere. So that could be a metaphor.
Well, a lot of people don't look up. And that's just a fact. People just generally don't look up at the skies and observe the skies. They're busy looking at the road, or they're busy looking down, or they're looking at their phones.
Or looking down,
there is a zombie apocalypse, and you see people walking around like this all the time, right? So even pilots don't notice some of these things. And it was interesting listening to the reports of pilots who have seen these things, and they're not necessarily believers. They've just had these experiences, and they go, like, I don't know what the hell I was looking at, but I mean, there were these lights that are, up above us, and the only thing that could be above us is military. And some of these commercial pilots are ex-military, and they call it in and go, hey, is there an aircraft in our local area? I've got something that's traveling around, at above 40,000 feet or whatever it is. I don't know what the specific figure is. And they know that there's above a certain level, the commercial airliners don't travel. Yeah. But above that, there may be some military craft. And so they call it in, and, the tower comes back and goes, we've got nothing in the area. And they go, well, I'm seeing something. There's these lights that are up there, and they're moving around. They're staying in position and coming with me for a period of time. Some of them, and it was really interesting listening to one of the pilots on Ryan Graves' podcast about the fact that a lot of pilots just sort of they travel the world, but they don't necessarily are always looking out the window looking for stuff.
I would have thought that they would, if anyone, they would see the most.
You would think so, but that's what I found interesting. It's like they're not really looking out the window for an extended period of time. It's their office. They start to then get up, do the work, start problem solving, doing whatever they're doing inside the cockpit. So they're not really looking up, but when they see things, that's where it gets interesting. And I think that, what Ryan Graves is trying to do as a pilot is he's trying to destigmatize it so that more commercial airline pilots and more, military airline pilots can come out and share what they've seen, because there's a big concern for some of them that they'll be perceived as being mentally unstable and therefore lose their pilot's license. And in Australia, maybe, I don't know, but in the US,
no, but you're right.
You don't need to go through a mental assessment to then be determined to be unfit to fly. If
I think you just hit the nail on the head of the reason why I was nervous, because I'm a therapist, right? I'm thinking, oh my God, like, people are going to think, is Joe got mental problems? So that's the
I'm
thing.
I'm a therapist as well. I just
I know. Yeah, I mean,
and this is the reason why we're having the conversation. Is
and that, thanks to you, that's why I feel you reached out, and that's why I feel like you didn't need permission, and that was so. Thank you. You mentioned America a lot. What's Australia's involvement? So, do we have any? I know that we're a bit poor and hick, but do we have?
We're definitely not poor and hick.
Okay, well, tell me, educate me. Like, what do we have? Because it's not obviously something that we talk about quite openly.
Well, I want to circle back a little bit to the whole belief thing, right? Because I just went and saw Ross Coulthart. Ross Coulthart is an Australian investigative reporter who's been on 60 Minutes. He's a mainstream news reporter who was encouraged to look at this story and look at the data, and it took him a little bit of time. I mean, listening to his story, he wasn't sort of like a straight out believer, though he was always interested in this stuff as a hobby, but not really sort of very interested. And you know, he's gone and he's done a whole bunch of investigative reports into the Australian Spy Intelligence Service and the CIA and all that sort of stuff. So he's a hard nosed investigative reporter. He's gone over to Afghanistan, and you know, he was like, but then he eventually started looking into it. And this is the thing: is when people say, "Oh, you know," because it hasn't been very good for his career in that sense. But I think that he's on the story of all stories, and he knows it, and he can smell it, right? And he said that when people say, "Oh, do you really believe in UFOs?" He goes, "I don't believe in it because it's not a religion." He says, if you look at the data, and you look at the data that's available in the public domain, there's a preponderance of data that suggests that, yes, this is a real thing. It's been going on for quite some time. And the fact that people aren't looking at it and investigating and following where the facts lead, he says that's the biggest surprise to him. But he says, I don't believe it. It's a fact. There's plenty of data, there's plenty of evidence, there's plenty of these things, there's plenty of testimony, there's plenty of witnesses. It goes back, at least 80 years. In modern history, maybe even 100 years now. We've got a sort of report that's come through in the 1930s that there may have been something that crashed in Italy. So this is the thing, is that from that perspective, that's an important thing. Now coming back to what was the question that you asked me?
Australia do we have like agencies here? Do we have like a base? Do we have something?
We absolutely have involvement in this, and it's been coming through in bits and pieces in recent sort of disclosures in the United States sort of Senate from people like, for instance, Sean Kirkpatrick, who heads up the all domain. What is it? I'll give you the exact name. I've got it written down here because I can't remember all these things. The All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which is an office that was set up by the United States government after the last Senate hearings to investigate these reports and to be a sort of an avenue to collate the data that's coming through the Department of Defense. And it was recently stated by Sean Kirkpatrick that members of the Five Eyes Alliance had been briefed in some way, shape or form on what was going on. So Australia is part of the Five Eyes Alliance, and Australia also has a rich history of UFO sightings, of which the Westall incident in Victoria is one of the most well-known and probably one of the most significant. And in Ross Coulthart's book, In Plain Sight, and dare I say, everyone should read that book, whether you believe or not, it doesn't really matter, just have a read of it. This guy is a lawyer by qualifications originally, he's an investigative journalist, and he spent 7-8 years researching the background to this book, and he, as he puts it in his recent talk, he did his PhD in ufology over the last 7 or 8 years, and he has pieced together so much of what's happened and the discussions that have happened and stuff that's in the Australian record as to what certain senior intelligence officers have said about the very real need to investigate this and make sure that we've actually got an office internally that monitors the movements of these craft, because they do potentially pose a national security threat, from an Australian senior officer. I can't remember the name of him. But that book is, in my opinion, one of the best books I've read that gives you a significant coverage of not only Australian involvement, or at least, what happened around things like Maralinga and Woomera, because there seems to be a relationship between nuclear testing and the appearance of these craft in that sort of domain. And you might almost say that our involvement with nuclear weapons potentially pose an existential threat to mankind, and it's sort of prompted whatever was sort of there maybe all along, and that's where
I agree,
to sort of go, hey, the kids have found the matches, and we might need to start doing something before they blow the whole place up. So there's often sightings around nuclear facilities. They seem to be very interested in nuclear facilities, and they also seem to be very interested in nuclear testing. And there's lots of interesting reports that are coming out from very, very credible individuals who are tasked with, in a sense, managing nuclear weapons facilities. They were the chief officer. They were the person who would press the button if need be. And appearance of craft, the systems being shut down remotely. And so, it's really interesting. Really interesting. So, but Australia has got a bit of a history. There's question marks about Pine Gap, Exmouth. Yeah. And there's also...
See, to me, that's the conspiracy part, not the UFOs. The conspiracy is, why would any government want to hide things? You know what I mean? That's what gets me pissed
I
off.
can give you plenty of reasons, and I don't think it's
I know. Well, I know, but that's what I'm saying. But the conspiracy, meaning that people say, "Oh, they're not. They are. We're not doing this. We haven't found anything." All the lies, right? Is that it's the thing about history, right? If you go back to all the wars that we've had, all the trauma, if you pick up the blueprint and apply it to today, it's the same. It's like we haven't really learned anything. So, for me personally, if there is other beings out there, I wouldn't come visit either. I wouldn't want to be, you know what I mean? Because it's like how something that you and I have talked about as well is that if they were to land, where are they going to go? Who are they going to be? Is America the place? Do they go to Russia? You know what I mean? We don't even have that community or that connection now. So in reality, I wouldn't want to, again, I try and put myself in their shoes if it was real or not. The world doesn't look appealing to me if I was to visit. It just doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what their interest is, and once again,
you would have thought they would have.
I don't know who they is, right?
I know, but it is interesting to think that if there was them, you think that by now they would have interjected. So I'm just more thinking about the spiritual element of it.
That's where it gets interesting, Joey. What's starting to come out, and I mean, I've read a lot of books in my time, and some of them are going, "Oh, that's interesting," and it's an interesting take on history. I think like Eric von Daniken and the ancient astronaut theory and all that sort of stuff was really interesting in regards to perhaps there had been visitations in the past. He got sort of poo-pooed by archaeologists. You got Graham Hancock and all those guys who are sort of like into alternate archaeology. But there definitely seems to be indications on planet Earth that there were other advanced civilizations that perhaps had a knowledge and an insight into the world that they've left. I mean, take a look at the pyramids. I mean, who knows how the pyramids were built? And they're not the way they used to be. I mean, there was a capstone that covered them, and it was nice and smooth. So you sort of see the top of, I think, the Great Pyramid, and you can sort of see a bit of what's left of the remnants of that. But the way it looks today is not the way it looked in its heyday. And also, there seems to be some sort of reference to some type of antediluvian civilization that pre-existed the Egyptian civilization, and that's where the sphinxes are quite interesting because they may have been pre-existing the pyramids, and when they take a look at the erosion pattern at the bottom of them. Now, once again, I don't know how much of what I've got in my head is disinformation.
No, you're right.
But
even Aboriginal art's got
Aboriginal art have got and also they've talked about the Min lights for a long time. In actual fact, some of the Arnhem land leaders would sort of like laugh and go, "Well, they've always sort of been here, right?" The thing is, though, I read a book many years ago. I highly recommend that people look into it and just keep an open mind. And the reason why I say keep an open mind is, people have a tendency to move away from being skeptical to being more cynical and closed-minded. So, I draw a distinction. With skepticism, it's being open-minded to the possibility that it may exist, but there's a lack of proof. And what you're looking for evidence and proof that then supports that claim. But you keep an open mind. Whereas some people are closed-minded and they go, "No, I'm not willing to look at that at all because it sort of, I find it challenging, or I find it a threat to my perception."
And that's what I meant earlier about the different type of people.
Yeah, and you get some people who are just flat over there, and they're the debunkers. And the debunkers don't look at the evidence; they just make their own crap up, and then they just create their own hypothesis, and then they go, "Oh, that's been debunked." And we've got a lot of that sort of stuff going on, where people go, "Oh, well, that's been solved, that's been debunked." It's like, no, you've just put forward an alternate hypothesis, but you actually haven't really presented any really compelling evidence. So I think you go back and you take a look at a book like, and this is the book that I'm recommending, The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin.
By the way, the people listening, I'll put all this information in the blurb later.
Beautiful. So he wrote this book many years ago. He's long gone now. And the 12th Planet was the work of a guy who, when he used to go to Jewish religious studies, he started to realize that there seemed to be an alternate interpretation of some of the Aramaic language that he was learning from the Torah. And he went, "Well, hang on a second. There seems to be an alternate meaning to this." And when he looked at it, he was like, "Well, that actually is really interesting. Like why would it be referenced in this way?" And there seemed to be some sort of implication of a technological advancement there that we weren't sort of really looking at. And he started looking back even further before the Torah and the Book of Genesis, and he said, "Well, the Book of Genesis is in actual fact an abbreviated version of a much larger book, much larger set of scriptures that came from Sumeria being the first civilization, of which." The Enuma Elish talks about, flesh and blood gods living on planet Earth, and that we were, being taught to do certain things, and it even goes back into the flood and all that sort of stuff. So it's really interesting. But what he said, what was really interesting is they had a cosmology, or an understanding of the way in which the solar system was set up and where Earth was relative to other planetary bodies, and they counted from the outside in, not from the inside out from the sun. And he found that really interesting. And he talked about what he called planet Nibiru, and Nibiru is this sort of like extra planet that seems to be operating in our solar system. Now, long after he put his ideas forward, science has started talking about this planet X, that there seems to be this planetary body that's circulating around, and we can't see it yet, but it seems to exert some sort of gravitational pull through the other planets, which sort of indicates that something's out there, but we don't know where. And this is where it gets really interesting. It sort of talks about this sort of involvement and the potential of some type of hominid that had been genetically engineered for the purposes of serving these supposed gods that were walking the planet, and were expecting us to do, well, us expecting the Adapa, Adam and Eve. It's quite interesting when you look at it. The work of these beings. So what's interesting is, I read that when I was in my, I think, early 20s. What's really interesting coming from people like Ross Coulthart is the stuff that's coming out of some of these intelligence sources that he has, is they're pointing to these beings may not be extraterrestrial. Whatever they are, they could be interdimensional. That's interesting. And may have been here for millennia and been involved in humanity's history and evolution, and that they're actively involved all along, but they've got an agenda. So I find that interesting that now this is starting to come up, right? So the open-minded piece, right? I read it back then and went, oh, okay, that's interesting, and I'll put that on the shelf. Sitchin actually wrote another book called The 12th Planet Revisited, which was, him sort of pointing to the stuff that he wrote in the 1970s that was then sort of proven to be more accurate over time as a result of NASA sending up probes to Mars and Phobos and so forth. So that's a worthwhile book reading after, sort of see where he started, see what sort of verified it. But what I'm interested in now is, I'm 49 now, I have to count it on my fingers. I read that in my 20s. So we're sort of coming to almost like a 30-year period, and now I'm starting to hear the same stuff that I read with Zecharia Sitchin, who was considered to be a little bit of a fringe guy. I'm hearing it coming from very reputable journalists like Ross Coulthart and others, who are basically reporting what's coming out of the intelligence community about where does this stuff come from, because now that we acknowledge that they exist, where do they come from, why they're here, and what's their intent, to they may have been here all the time, which is the reason why a recent whistleblower by the name of David Grush, who is an intelligence officer who was involved in briefing the President of the United States on UAP. He had exposure to over something like 20,000 special access programs. He was sworn in. He's an incredibly important person in this sort of juncture in time. He was asked, well, they kept referencing in this recent Senate hearing, and you can find the full Senate hearing that happened. It was streamed and it's online. I think I'll see if I can find the link for you so that everyone can go back and watch it. They keep talking about extraterrestrials, and he goes, I prefer not to call it extraterrestrials.
I saw that. Yeah.
I prefer to call it NHI because it keeps the aperture open. Now, I don't know what the aperture is. Is it the aperture of the sorts of things that they're using to try and track and find these things in our?
I thought it was more about the fact that we don't have to associate them as being. They could be. They don't have to be physical. They could be, and there's many different ways that things can be. Like, you know what I mean? Like when you look at the moon and the gravity, right? Yeah. We can't see that. Right, so that to me is what it means. It doesn't have to be something that I can identify as being something physical.
That's how I read it differently. The aperture is something that you have with a camera, right?
Right. Okay.
But also, aperture can also be the way we perceive things through our mind, and the filters that we use. And if we're busy going, oh, they're extraterrestrial, and we keep putting these telescopes out trying to find these things, and then you've got scientists going, no, there's nothing out there. Well, perhaps we're missing out on some of the other possibilities, and if they defy our understanding of, physics and time and space and their ability to travel, perhaps between time and space, which is what he's sort of pointing to, then we're looking in the wrong direction because our aperture has been narrowed as a result of going extraterrestrial, therefore spacefaring, and it may not be. And so I thought that was a really interesting distinction.
Yeah.
And also the fact that he said non-human intelligence opens it up to all sorts of different things, not just simply biological.
Yeah. You do realize that you need to come back.
Sorry.
Because you do realize you need to come back, and because the thing is you're out of time and you've left it.
Okay.
It's like watching a series and there's a cliffhanger. It's like
Well, I'm
you
just
started. Yeah, but I think what
I'm
happened
just a
was
journeyman on this.
I think we tickled you to get to open up, and then you just opened up because now we've gone into a bigger chapter. So,
Yeah, okay.
let's just want to give us just one final. What's something you could say to the listeners about how they could be, what they can do to be open? What would you say to them to connect with what you were saying earlier about the openness of self?
Right. So I'll just remind everybody, one, how different is your world going to be tomorrow? Right? Probably not. You probably wake up and you'll go to your job and you'll do your things and all that sort of stuff. So it's very easy to get down the rabbit hole with this sort of stuff, and it gets very woo. It does. And I've had moments where I've just gone, the implications of this, and I'm just like having anxiety, and I'm just going, what does this mean? Like how? And I have to remind myself that tomorrow nothing really is going to change. So if any of you feel challenged by this, well, it's up to you as to the degree and to the extent that you get involved with this. Just remember that words are not facts and they're not evidence. So when you hear testimony and things like that, it's important to recognize that that's just simply the subjective perspective at times of people and their theories, but it doesn't necessarily make it a fact. I think we're seeing a lot of confirmation and we're seeing a lot of stuff come out, and I'm just inviting people to keep an open mind, because when you have an instant response, you go, oh, that's rubbish, it's bullshit, it's all that sort of stuff. That's part of what's happened, is that there's been such a strong disinformation campaign and stigmatization of this subject that not even the mainstream media are covering it. And that's something that Ross Coulthard has basically been mind blown by. And also the senators in the United States have gone, the mainstream media need to cover this, because this is real. It's coming. It's whatever it is, we need to look into it. Either we've got a bunch of people who are in very senior positions in government organizations who have absolutely lost their minds and they're in control of nuclear weapons, or this is a very real phenomena and we've got to look at it either way. So no matter what's going to happen, they're looking at it. There is pushback from organizations that have vested interest in protecting themselves from potential criminal investigations, because there is criminality involved with this, with what's going on with the way it's been hidden. But I'm going to put it to our audience here today: keep an open mind. Recognize that whatever comes up first, sit with it, and then just go, how else could I look at this? And that's the beauty of being, in a sense, an open-minded and skeptic. I've seen stuff that is being unidentified. It's flying. I don't believe it's extraterrestrial, but it's anomalous. And that's really all this is unidentified anomalous phenomena. Some of it is prosaic, for sure. You can explain it away. You can swamp gas, Venus, whatever it is. But there's some other stuff that absolutely isn't. And when you start to take a look at people like Barack Obama, who's now come out and said, yes, we're capturing these things on sensors. There's stuff that flies that we don't know how it flies. You're seeing, one of the top, Democratic politicians in the United States overseeing and putting together legislation that talks about non-human intelligence and exotic craft, and also things that aren't made by man, and putting that into law. That has to sort of spark your attention that perhaps this isn't just simply tinfoil hat individuals. It's not going to be something that is just the domain of conspiracy theorists. This has implications for all of us. It has implications for consciousness. And it also, if we can access this technology, has implications for the rest of the world as well. So it's a very exciting and interesting time, but I can understand why some people just don't want to look at it.
Yeah.
And I can understand why some people would freak out about it, because it's paradigm shifting.
Audience, I just want to speak to you directly right now. Aren't we lucky to have this person talking to us? Because you could just talk for hours, you know what I mean? Because it's listened. So I love it when I meet someone, or I know someone that knows their stuff. So Paul, thank you so much for, I don't know if I should do a simple sign of goodbye, just wave. I'll wave. All right, mate. If it's okay with you, I'd love to bring you back, and we can I didn't ask you one of my questions. Do you know that? One of my questions that I had on my list, I did not ask you one, so I love that. So yes, if you want to come back, I think you can't just tease us and then just leave. We've got to need to know more now. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And once again, I'd invite, if you're looking for some next steps there, I'd recommend that you look at Ross Coulthard and Bryce Zabel's website and their podcast. So Need to Know, so needtoknow.today. And also their podcast is Need to Know. So that's where you're going to get pretty current and really credible info coming through. I'd also recommend Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp's web podcast, and that's Weaponized. And they seem to be really, they've got their finger on the pulse of things, and they've got some very good intelligence contacts. And also Ryan Graves as well, with his Merge podcast, because if you want to hear from somebody who's a trained naval aviator, I mean, I think it costs them something like $6 million to educate someone like that. He's an intelligent guy, but he's also advocating that the stigma goes away, that they increase the amount of awareness. And I think that there's some pretty steady sort of paths to travel that aren't too woo, and yet will give you a good sort of briefing. And it's a very deep subject. So thank you. It was a privilege to talk about this. I don't usually get into this stuff. It's usually hypnosis work or stuff like that.
You'll be interviewed again because I want to know more. So thank you, and see you soon. Okay. Okay, everybody, you're listening to the Harder Shaft podcast. So, like we talked, everything will be down below. So don't forget to go through all that list of things that Paul brought up, and also hit like and subscribe, and we can then update you on our latest podcast. So have a great week, month. Until next time, don't stop playing with your shaft. Okay, bye.